Welcome, everybody, to the March meeting of Christian fiction fans. I'm Deb Brown, and we are here with Amy Green. And I'm going to read you, excuse me, her bio so we know a little bit of her background, and then we'll jump into asking her some questions. Amy Lynn Green is a lifelong lover of books, history, and library cards. She worked in publishing for 6 years before writing her first historical fiction novel based on the World War II home front of Minnesota, the state where she lives, works, and survives long winters. And she just was reminding me that we're going to get snow probably in a couple days again here. She has taught classes on marketing at writers' conferences and regularly encourages established and aspiring authors in their publication journeys. In her novels and her daily life, she loves exploring the intersection of faith and fiction and searches for answers to present-day questions by looking to the past. If she had lived in the 1940s, you would have found her writing long letters to friends and family, daydreaming about creating an original radio drama, and drinking copious amounts of non-rationed tea. Actually, these things are fairly accurate in her modern life as well. She has 4 historical fiction novels, all set in World War II, with a 5th coming out in June. Foxhole Victory Tour was a finalist for the Christie Award. So welcome, Amy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's going to be fun.
Yes, it is. Well, we would love it if you would just start by telling us your journey to becoming an author. There was a little bit of it there in your bio, but tell us about that. Did you always want to be an author since you were a little girl, or did it kind of just happen?
Great question. So I did always enjoy reading from the time I was very young. My mom taught me how to read before kindergarten, so I was off to the races, getting as many books out of the library as I could every week. Um, and at some point, I realized that somebody writes those books, and that was extremely exciting to me as a child because I thought, oh, maybe I could do that someday. But there was a long period of time in between that childhood dream and going to college and thinking, oh, I want to study something related to writing, but maybe I'll study publishing. And got my first job in publishing and on the marketing side of publishing. So as you mentioned, that's kind of my specialty because it still involves writing, like on more of the press release side of things
Mhm.
and I wrote a lot of book discussion questions for book clubs as part of my marketing role, which
Yeah.
is fun. And at that time, I wasn't really doing much writing for publication. But eventually, as I started reading more and doing analysis of books as part of my publishing job, I thought, maybe I should get back into the actual writing. And I wrote a number of things, of rough drafts of books that will never see the light of day. And then I finally had the idea for things we didn't say and actually showed it to one of my coworkers since I worked in publishing. So this is very different than most people's publication
Yeah,
stories.
yeah.
Um, and he said, this is really interesting. I haven't read a book told in letters in the Christian market before,
Mm.
and it feels like something that would work really well. And so he asked me to put a fake name on it so that he could show it to other editors, which I did because since they were my coworkers, they
Sure.
knew would know me, and he didn't
Yes.
want them either to be biased toward me or if they didn't like it to feel bad
Yeah.
since they knew me. And so it went through the normal publication channels after that, as far as like going to a publication board. But the funny thing is, I'm usually at the publication board. And I usually am one of the people who decide whether we give contracts to authors. So I scheduled a meeting at the same time as our pub board meeting,
Love
mysteriously, so I didn't
it.
have to show up. But my favorite story I like to tell is our copywriter came into my office, a friend of mine, and she said, Amy, you have to read. Have you read the World War II chapters yet for that we're discussing at Pub Board? Because the main character's sense of humor just really reminds me of you.
Oh, I love it.
So she was very pleased when she found out the truth, and we like to
Oh,
tell that story because it's a lot of fun.
yeah,
So
that's
not a
really
very
cool.
typical publication journey, but
No.
it's a fun one.
Yeah, yeah. So you just slipped right into your own publishing company.
Yep,
So,
that's
and
kind of
that's
how it
Bethany
happened.
House.
Yep.
So fun.
So
Now
I
you,
don't work there anymore. I
okay,
had
I
to
was going
leave
to
when
ask.
I was when my first child was born because I could not write keep a child alive and work at the same time. And I figured we should probably keep the child alive.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, 2 out of 3, you know.
yep. Hmm.
That's a good compromise.
Hmm.
Oh, that's awesome. So now, at this point, how many books have you written? And
Hmm.
Foxhole Victory Tour is, I think, the most recent release, but maybe there
Hmm.
are some more in the works as
Yep.
well.
So I've written Foxhole is the most recent one. I have one more that's coming out in June of this year called The Codebreaker's Daughter.
Hmm.
And that's what set in World War I and World War II. So I got to
Okay,
do a little bit of both for that one. And then I'm working on the next project, but I've just barely started the research and writing for that. So that one's gonna be a long way out. I think that's 2026 or something like that. So
sure, sure. So the writing process, you're talking about how far out this is. How long did it
mhm.
take you to write that first novel versus how long does it take you now? And maybe we can't even make a good comparison because now you have small children, so that just
Oh,
complicates it even more.
yeah. It's a pretty funny comparison because my first novel I wrote when I was not married and did not have children. And
Mm,
that is a totally different life
for sure.
than, and now I have two children. So I've got a 3-year-old and a 8-month-old baby. So the first novel I wrote probably, it was the fastest, it was the easiest and fastest thing I've ever written.
Wow.
I don't know why, like for some reason, the letter format was really easy for me to write, and I think
Hmm.
it took me 7 or 8 months. Now I write 18 months. It takes
Okay.
me 18 months to write a book. So, a lot of things going on, obviously. I have a different
Sure.
full-time job, and the mom
Absolutely.
full-time job doesn't come with regular office hours. So,
But it's far more important.
it
So
is.
good
Yep,
for you
for
for
sure.
finding that balance for yourself. I was trying to think if I have it handy. I don't think I do. So, fun family story. My grandfather served in World War II when he
Oh.
was a newlywed, and he and his wife wrote letters back and forth. You're talking about this
Mhm.
book that's all letters. And of course, she saved all of his letters, and he did not save all of hers. But a few years ago, my mom, who's on the call here, Linda, found them hidden away in a closet in my uncle's house. And we pulled them out and I assembled them all. So it's a one-sided story, but he wrote like daily letters to her
Mm.
through his time in the service, and he was still stateside. He never ended up getting deployed, but it
Mhm.
was also during the time when my mother was born. So he
Mhm.
was writing about this baby that they were expecting. And it's just a really, really sweet thing that we have in our family now because I typed it up for everyone to be able to see it. So
That is so special. I love that.
yeah, yeah, it's super fun. So you seem to have a specialty in World War II. Are all of your
Mhm.
novels set there, but this next one will
Ex
be partly World War One?
Yep, the next one coming out is half and half, but all of the other ones have been World War II.
So how did you become a World War II specialist?
Well, funny that you should ask. It wasn't necessarily on purpose. I mean, I always have enjoyed reading World War II fiction and
Mhm.
nonfiction, actually. And so that has been a part of my life for a long time. But I was looking at when I moved to Minnesota after college, so 11 or 12 years ago, actually. I thought, I know nothing about the history of Minnesota. What is this state? I'm originally from Indiana.
Okay.
And so I was looking, as I was looking at projects, I was thinking about new ideas because, like I said, I had written a number of things that I didn't like very much. And some of the reason was research was hard. And I thought, if I want to make research easy, why don't I pick something that I can research like from where I am living currently?
Yeah.
Um, and I found that there were prisoner of war camps in Minnesota for German prisoner
Mm.
of war during World War II, and also that was a school for Japanese linguists. So
Okay.
Japanese Americans training to be spies and translators and negotiators during World War II. And I thought, wow, that's the most interesting thing that I found. I found like there were lots of other things, of course, that happened in Minnesota history, but those two things stood out to me as the most interesting. So I wrote my first novel set in World War II. And as I was researching that one, I found other bits of research that I thought, oh, conscientious objectors in Minnesota, that's interesting. Can't write a whole novel about them because in Minnesota they did like a starvation project, and people not eating for a long period of time just doesn't make a very interesting book.
Kind of a boring
But
storyline.
that led me to another idea about
Uh-huh.
conscientious objectors being smoke jumpers. And in researching that one, I found, and so on and so forth. So it was more like a little rabbit trail
Yeah.
of connected, interesting news story ideas that I found as I've gone on, that has made World War II something that I really enjoyed writing about.
How fun. Yeah, that's neat. One thing just kind of leads to another.
Yep.
Um, so most World War II books are like really horrible in some way. We're dealing with the awful Nazis and horrible, horrible things, but this
Mhm.
one was much lighter because you picked a USO troop. Tell us about
Mhm.
how that idea came to be.
Yeah, somebody was asking me recently, like, is there such a thing as cozy World War II fiction? Because I feel like that's what you write.
Yes, that's
And
what
I
this
said,
was.
it's a lot easier to have like a sense of humor and lightness to your stories when you're not in the Holocaust or
Yes.
occupied France or places
Mhm.
where you don't want to make that funny. Like we
Yeah,
have to treat that with the seriousness that it
sure.
deserves. But a lot of my stories have been predominantly home front stories. Foxhole Victory Tour was the first one that isn't a home front story, but it still sort of feels like it because they're bringing kind of home to the troops.
Hmm.
Um, and so I choose to write about that partly because I didn't know that much about what was happening in the home front during World War II. And I knew a lot more, partly because of all the fiction books that have been covering that, and they've done a great job. And I decided I'm not going to compete with all those other books that have
Sure.
handled those serious aspects of World War II in such a brilliant way. I'm going to write about things that I've never heard about before, which led me to things like the USO troops. I had seen lots of Bob Hope routines and jokes, and I
Hmm.
knew that the USO was doing things, but I'd never read a novel that followed any of the USO characters. It was a lot of fun. That some of the research was just, watching comedy routines. So that's
How
the kind of
fun.
research you want to be doing. And I enjoyed having that aspect to history to explore.
Yeah, yeah, it's super fun and I really enjoyed it. And I was curious too, do you have a musical background? Because this really, or some sort of performer, because we've got a magician on here and all sorts of
Yeah.
things, but
I did choir,
okay.
and I am deeply hopeless at musical instruments because I'm not a good multitasker. So I would panic and I can't see the notes and play the notes
I
at the
see.
same time in rhythm. But I did talk to several of my musician friends for some help with things. But I also enjoy theater and performance-based things. I've never done anything for it career-wise, obviously, but
Right.
as an amateur, I have enjoyed many of those things.
You're an appreciator and a listener of
Yep.
music more than a
Hmm.
producer, and that's
Definitely.
That's awesome. I love that. So the title, the Foxhole Victory Tour,
Hmm.
that was plucked out of, I'm sure you chose the name for this tour. How did you come up with that name?
I'm trying to remember this one. So authors don't always choose their own titles.
Right.
Sometimes they suggest titles and then the publisher suggests other ones. I'm pretty sure that for all of mine, either like it's the title that I've had since the beginning, or it was in the list of titles that I gave, and I said,
Hmm.
just if any of these don't work, I can come up with another dozen of them.
Sure.
Um, I'm pretty sure this one originally. Oh, I think at one point the title was something about victory girls, and then we found out that in certain army slang that would be a term for a prostitute.
Oh,
And so we said, maybe let's not call it
not.
that. Let's make sure we're distinct on that so people don't get confused about what this book is about. So I think that was the reason this one changed a little bit from the original title, but we definitely wanted people to know that the word victory is so synonymous with the USO and the slogans at the time that we really wanted to make sure that aspect was brought out in the title.
Yeah. And there weren't any actual tours in real life by this name. You That was just something you came up
Right.
with. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Fun, fun. So often there's a kernel of truth in a fictional story, and especially in historical fiction where you've done a lot of research, some of that watching videos,
Yeah.
but also on your website for anybody who's on here. You should go. She's got just a whole section on the background and research on each one of her books, and it's really fascinating. But tell us a little bit about the things that you researched that inspired events in your book.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite parts about the research is finding individual events to include or historical people that I can sneak in,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I did and I mentioned that on my website too in a few places. But I think the general idea that sparked the specific tour is that there was a group of four women, Hollywood stars, who went to North Africa around the time of the troop in my novel. And they got a ton of fanfare and they described all of their experience, some of which are things that really happened in, or I use versions of them in my story. Like they sat through an air raid drill in one of the cities in a hotel basement and things like that. And other like they were in a plane that was shot at and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So lots of good drama to use there. But in a lot of my USO resource books, there would be a mention of, and then there were these other troops that were filled with people who were just kind of your average performers, right?
Uh-huh.
So not Bob Hope, not Mitzi Mayfair and Martha Ray and all the big names, but just ordinary people who worked in the arts and wanted to
Mm-hmm.
support the troops in different ways. So that intrigued me enough that I thought, nobody there's maybe a paragraph about these other people in all of these
Mm-hmm.
books, but they have stories too. And so I did a little more digging to find letters and memoirs about their experiences. It was a little hard to find sometimes because the USO performers weren't allowed to keep a diary or take pictures
Oh, yeah.
while they were touring because they might be leaking military secrets accidentally. So all of this information was coming after the war when they were writing down the things that they experienced. So,
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. You slid that into the book and it never would have occurred to me. And nowadays, we have our camera on our phone and, we can send texts and emails and get so much information out. But at that day, to think that you can't even bring your camera, you can't take
yeah.
pictures, you can't write down, and then every letter that goes out is being censored too,
Hmm.
so that they're careful not to divulge any information. So
Yeah.
that was all quite fascinating. Um, so sometimes there's a little piece of the author in the characters that she
Mhm.
writes. Do you relate in some way to any of the characters in this book? Do they reflect something about you?
I don't know that any of these characters have my particular personality. Sometimes more of that comes through. I think oftentimes characters have my sense of humor because it's hard to be funny with someone else's sense of humor.
Right.
So oftentimes the kind of jokes the characters are making are probably things that I think are funny. Whether anyone else does or not, I'm always amused. But I think one of the things of Maggie struggling with the idea of rest and
Mm,
taking on too much and feeling like she needed to do things to prove herself and be
yeah.
valuable is definitely something that I often come back to in my own life is what does it look like to say no? What does it look like to say I need to rest to
Hmm.
yourself or to other people? And so I think that's the little bit of myself that I put in this one of I think there are a lot of women who feel this, so it's not extremely
Absolutely.
unique to me, but it's
Yes.
definitely something that I have felt and experienced along with my character.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really good point because I do think that is a woman thing. Like we've got to get all the stuff done. Everybody's relying on us,
Yep.
and some of us can be high overachiever types that feel like we have to check everything off a list. I'm one of those people.
I love a list.
Yes, lists are great. Um, but yeah, so I think that was a really good lesson that we do need to take time. And there were quotes. I just put up some quotes the other day, yesterday, about the Sabbath and
Mhm.
having that as a day of rest and how important that is. And I think we've probably all caught in a cold or something where we've kind of got kicked off our feet because we've chosen not to rest and to push ourselves too far. So that was
Yep.
a really nice theme in the book. So during your writing and revising process, stories will always change. Can you think of
Mhm.
anything specific in this book that changed? There's a saying called kill your darlings. Did you have to kill
Yeah.
any of your darlings in this book? Favorite sections or characters?
I mean, I always write way too long.
Hmm.
Like all of my books, I end up having to cut like half a book from it by
Wow.
the time I'm done. Um, and that was also the case with this one. And I'm sure there are other things that got cut, but one thing I remember thinking of, I had like a whole scene with where the military police thought they were going on dates with officers and like that caused all this drama and it was very funny because some of those women like I think Judith was the main one involved with the dressing down of the MP and almost getting them all in trouble and kicked out. So they are funny, but like it didn't actually advance the plot in any way. It was just
Right.
a fun way for Judith to be Judith.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't mind. I save them. Sometimes I'll send them out to my newsletter list or
Oh,
something
yeah.
like that with like a little deleted scene.
Yeah, fun.
Um, yeah, and there were a lot from my book that's releasing in June because it covers two time periods.
Mm.
And I think when I was planning it, I thought, yeah, like this will be easy. Like it's a mother-daughter story. We'll do World War One and World War Two. And I think I just planned out a full book for both World War One and World War Two, and then had to cut it into one book.
Mm.
So I've got some good deleted scenes from that one in particular that didn't have time to be in the book.
I bet. It should have almost been a two-book series, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it probably is better as one book because then it makes me cut the things that are like fun or like interesting historical facts,
Yeah.
but not necessarily advancing the plot.
Yep.
So I never mind doing it. But every now and then I'm sad that readers don't get to see a particular joke or something like that. But I
Sure.
always save those things just in case I can use them in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your writing process. And now with two young children, I'm sure it's changed. You mentioned
Hmm.
that before, but
Yep.
how do you balance that in your day? Are you someone who gets up early and writes every day, or you just like fit it into nap time? How do you do it?
Mhm. Yeah, this I always tell people will ask me this, especially at like writers' conferences,
Hmm.
and I say, "Oh, I hate that you asked me that because I don't recommend this. Like, this is not going to work for most people. You may, but I think that's true. Anybody's writing process,
Sure.
right, is
Yeah.
not going to work for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, I never wrote consistently at a particular time of day, particular place. I wrote when I could in between things. It's just that before having kids, there were a lot more free spaces in which to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
So this one, the Foxhole Victory Tour, I wrote almost exclusively after the birth of my first child. And some of it I dictated into my phone while pushing a
Mm.
stroller. Some of it I did the editing while I was holding her because she wouldn't fall asleep for a few months unless she was in
Mhm.
my arms. Um, and often I have a friend who does childcare for me one day a week in the mornings. My husband takes particular nights and sets them aside, and those are nights that I just do writing. So it's office hours when you can,
Yeah.
but I don't even work at a desk. I sit in a chair, I sit in my bed, I write in a notebook or on my computer or my phone or whatever's handy. So it's a very hodgepodge way, and I also work on whatever part of the book I feel like
Yeah.
at that particular time or whatever I've just done research on. And then I put it all together at
Hmm.
the end. So again, not necessarily recommended because it takes a lot of editing to clean it all up after I'm done, but it is what has to be done right now because I don't
Yeah.
want to shortchange the other areas of my life.
Yeah.
And I think I would have to if I was going to set be very strict about my writing. There would be other things that I would have to let go of, and I would rather let go of my strict writing schedule.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, it's different for every author, and you've found
Yes.
what works for you at this time in your life, and
Yep.
it'll change again, I'm sure.
It'll change, I'm sure. Hmm.
So what challenges did you face when writing this particular book? You mentioned you wrote most of it when your daughter was a newborn, so that
Yeah.
seems like a challenge. Were there any
Postpartum
others?
depression.
Oh
We
gosh.
love that for me. No, but seriously, I think there was a time that I had to just step away from writing and be like, if nothing gets written in this time, that's going to be okay. My
Yeah.
identity is not in the things that I do. And I think I asked for an extension for this one to turn it in too because it just wasn't getting done.
Yeah.
So that was a challenge. Sometimes there was a challenge in finding specific details, like place names have changed in North Africa since the story was written, so it was really
Hmm.
hard to figure out what is the distance between these places because the
Yeah.
names have changed, and also what transportation, like what I can see physically on the map how far away these places are, but what was transportation like and what was the
Yeah.
terrain like? And so when I got to the point when I was doing nitty-gritty, I love research, but I like reading people's stories.
Hmm.
Like I love reading the letters, like you were talking about,
Yeah.
Deb and Linda. Like those are the fun things. I don't love figuring out what sort of desert road, how many checkpoints, all the very nitty-gritty boring
Yeah.
things. But I try to do my due diligence because somebody's gonna know, like somebody's grandpa is gonna be on that ship that I
Right.
mentioned, and they're gonna care if I get it right or wrong. So
Yes.
I try to do my best with those details, but I'm sure I've made mistakes. My editors are great at catching things, but there probably still are things that slip through because that's just the nature of human error.
For sure. For sure. Well, I would like to give a chance for the other people on this call. If you have any questions or comments for Amy, feel free to jump in, unmute, or you can type it in the chat if you don't want to speak up.
Yeah, I am an open book, so if you have any
Ooh.
questions about writing process or um, any of any of my books in particular or anything.
I wanted to comment on, I was so glad to hear you say that your coworker said, "Oh, you should read this because it sounds like your sense of humor." Because
Mhm.
that was going to be one of my questions
Mm,
was how, you know, if that came naturally to you
mhm,
or if you had to like work at putting the humor in it. But I think you answered my question when you said that they said that they just, so is that something that your whole family has a sense of humor? Or was it something that you like learned from a grandparent? Or because I have to tell you that this book was such a serious topic, and yet like you mentioned, it was light. I think Deb said that it's light. So I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it. I waited until the last minute to read it, and I'm like, 40 chapters. And I said, okay, I need to read 10 chapters a day for 4 days before today, right?
mhm,
And I was like, can I do it? Can I do it? Are you kidding me? I had to stop myself after 10
um,
chapters because I was so engrossed in the story. It was so lovely. The humor, the family. They created a family
mhm,
from strangers to family. That was so touching. And then there was twice in the book that I was crying and I was like, how did she come up with this?
mhm,
It was so moving. One time was when um, they were playing the song in
mhm.
for the camp.
I
Mhm.
cried too, so.
That
Yes.
was beautiful.
Even before they mentioned that they were going to sing,
Mhm,
just talking about the camp
mhm.
started getting me. I'm like, okay, I don't want to go there. But
Yep.
then it ended up beautiful the way you did that. And then the other time was oh, when was the other time? I'll think of it. It was because that was more like in the middle. The other time was closer to the end. Um, and it was just so I just wanted to say that I love the humor and then the the depth of the family dynamic, creating a family, and because they all had family issues.
Mhm,
Most of they all had family issues in their own way. um, so they had that need for some
mhm.
sort of family dynamic. And then yeah, the one was it was so moving. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Like that's that's my hope because I love to laugh. I also love to think about things that are harder. But there are some people I know. I have a friend of mine who's doing her doctorate on genocide, and I couldn't do that. Like I wouldn't be able to spend that much time in dark places, even for a really good cause. And so I like to have both in the same story. Have to remember that there were hard and serious things going on. So we don't want to think like, ooh, World War II, it was just a party. Like everybody's having fun. Because obviously that's not true. But also to remember that there was a lot of good and a lot of hopeful things that were happening at the same time.
And you
And
even
as
got
far
me,
as
I was going to
I
say,
was,
you even got me to look up, I hadn't heard of Helene Benatar.
yeah.
And so I had to do an online search and oh my goodness, yeah, I was like, I can't believe I've never heard of her before.
She's
Um,
great. There was a scene with her too that had to be cut for time because it also didn't relate to the main plot, but I was sad because I think she's fantastic. So,
So I'm
anyway,
gonna piggy off of that one, and then we've got a couple more in the chat that I'll read to
sure.
you. But that scene where they play the song to the camp, was that something that you found in research, or you just fabricated that with your wonderful imagination?
Not specifically to the camps. There were times that USO troops were not allowed to go in particular places because it was too close to the fighting or too dangerous. But they would try to get as close to it as they could, so that people like sometimes when they were going into France, it might have been like across enemy lines where prisoners of war were being kept or things like that. And we don't know who heard
Hmm.
but there's the hope that someone who needed it could hear. But
Yeah.
there was no specific mention of the camps in North Africa, but there was a lot of talk about at the same time that the troop was going through, the American soldiers were really concerned, like, how are we here occupying this country and there are still camps open? And so that was a discussion that would have been natural for the USO to engage with for sure.
Hmm.
So,
Cool.
yeah.
that was actually the second time. Now I remember the second time I cried was when they were supposed to perform in front of a group that lost
Mm,
members. And I
mhm,
was like, oh my goodness, so what do you do? Do you go on with the show or do you? And that was handled so beautifully.
mm,
Just the way you weaved each of the characters had something to contribute to that moment.
mm.
And secrets came out. Was that something that you created or was that a historical, something you found?
I
That
mean,
was
that is
genius.
Oh, thank you. I think the sentiment is something that a lot of the USO members said. Like they would say, like, hey, we had to perform at a hospital where like a lot of people had lost limbs and also friends. What does it look like? Like the army doesn't want us to be overly sympathetic and make them feel like they need our pity. So we don't want to talk down to them, but we also want to be sensitive to their loss. And it just made they would say like it made everything feel so real, like what we were doing really mattered. So that those were the times that the USO performers said when they were performing for people who had gone through something immediately before hearing them, that they felt most purposeful in what they were doing. So yeah.
I bet. Well, Ms. Grove is having audio problems, so she's written a few in the chat. She
Mhm.
said, is there a character you wrote that you didn't like?
That's a good question. Not in this one, I don't think. I tend to like most of my characters, even the ones that other people don't like even prickly characters,
Yeah.
even um because chances are there were a lot of deleted scenes you don't see where like I understand them even better, like thing like I
Yes.
know what's gone on behind the scenes
Yeah.
kind of. So for that reason I'm usually more sympathetic. I don't think there was anyone I didn't like in this one. As far as like some of them I wouldn't want to go on a long road trip with. Like Judith and I would kill each other if we went on a road trip, I feel like. But I mean maybe we wouldn't. Maybe we'd learn to get along. But yeah, I think I liked all of
Okay.
them.
She is also wondering, how did you choose to write the two characters as such opposites, Maggie
Mhm.
and Catherine, and why did you choose to do that?
Oh, good question. So the way this is a little bit of my writing process. I don't outline all the things in my
Mhm.
books because I'm sort of writing it out of order and things like that. I usually have a general idea of where I'm going, but I usually almost always start out one, like knowing some of the history that I want to include, and two, I think given that history that I want to explore, who would be the worst possible people to put in these situations? So, I've got a mystery to solve where the government is hiding something. Well, I'm going to make it be investigated by a conscientious objector who doesn't think you should lie. Or there's a prisoner of war camp where they need a translator who's like really delicate and tactful. I'm going to put the person who has no sense of tact or other people's feelings. And in this case, I thought we're going to stick people in close proximity for a long tour. Let's make them complete opposites and come from very different social backgrounds and see how they get along. I feel like, okay, this is I feel like sometimes romance writers do this where they're like, it's opposites attract or like
Mhm.
enemies to lovers sort of
Right.
trope, you know? I don't love that because in real life, I know very few people who start out as enemies and then should get married by the
Right.
end, right? I think I know exactly two couples who started out hating each other and then discovered they were secretly in love
Yeah.
with each other. But when it comes to things like coworkers who are stuck together on a tour, I feel like that happens a lot more in real life where you are
True.
forced to work with someone you can't
True.
stand
Yeah.
and you learn to appreciate each other. Maybe you shouldn't get married, but you can learn to work and care for each other. So
Yeah.
that's my silly answer, is that it was like a romance novel, except it was just two people who had to work together.
Yeah. Well, that ups the conflict when you think
Yeah.
about what's going to be the most difficult personality to put in this
Yes.
situation. It
And no offense to romance authors who do that, because
right.
it's very fun to read. It's
Yes.
just in real life, most of us married someone we liked,
Yeah.
not someone we didn't like.
Exactly. Only makes sense. Um, she was also wondering, is there an author you enjoy reading for fun?
Oh, I mean, for fun. Like, if I'm just like, I've been reading a lot of Jeeves and Wooster lately,
Okay.
which are very silly British books, written in like turn of the century sort of
Okay.
setting and the time period. They're just ridiculous and they're fun to listen in audio.
Okay.
I've also been going through a Dorothy Sayers mystery kick of classic mystery. So all of these are like books these are not current authors,
Uh-huh.
but they work so well. I listen to a lot of my books right now.
Uh-huh.
Um, and there's something both murder mysteries, like classic murder mysteries like Agatha Christie and whatnot, and Jeeves and Wooster follow a fairly predictable formula. So
Hmm.
they're a lot easier to listen to in audio for me, and especially with the slight like brain fog that I'm currently in with a baby, have
Sure.
been
The
really
constant
lighthearted and fun.
interruptions.
Yes, exactly. If I can't, this is not the time for me to read a deep book of philosophy and try
Right.
to parse it.
Yeah.
So that's what I read for fun right now.
Nice. Um, she's
Ooh,
also
good
commenting
recommendation.
she also loves Jeeves and Wooster, and she
Mhm.
said Georgette Heyer is a great author
Yes.
with humor and great time periods.
I haven't read any of hers yet, but it's been on my list. So,
Yeah. Do you have any
So
current authors that have inspired you or that you really like their work?
I mean, I love Sarah Sundin as a person and also her books, and I am excited to read her latest one, which I believe is set in Scotland.
Okay.
So I would recommend. And also Amanda Dykes. I feel like I have really enjoyed everything I have read of her. A lot more, but those are the two that come to mind because I know that they have new releases coming up and you should check them out.
Yeah. Yeah, we're always looking for our next author to bring on here, so that's super
Mhm.
I
fun.
have a comment.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the beginning of the book really hit home for me. I was born in 1944 in Minneapolis and talking about Dayton's downtown. I remember when I used to go shopping with my mom and my grandma for the sales down there. And there was something you mentioned later on about girdles.
Hmm.
And like a teenager with about 100 pounds on me going down to get a girdle. And
Yes.
it really, it hit home. The other thing was Leo. I would never have guessed that part of the story.
Mm-hmm. So on the first part, Linda, one of the proofreaders who was doing fact checking for me, also was a big fan of Dayton's, and she made a comment and she said, "Just so you know, the mannequins on this floor, I can't remember if it was I think they had faces, and I said they were faceless." And
Yeah.
she remembered that, and she checked and
No.
made sure that that was real. She says, "So if you want, you can change this. No one's gonna care." And I said, but you remembered and you care, so we might as well change it. So, um, we had somebody also who fondly remembered Dayton's who was
Yeah.
doing the fact checking for me there. Um, yes, and on Leo, um, my editor said, as I was reading, I thought to myself, Amy usually doesn't let characters have like a very predictable romance, happy, yes, there can be happy endings for romances, but this one I'm suspicious of. And so she just because she knew me, she was like, I don't know that this is gonna work out the way they think it's gonna work out. So,
Yeah, he was a
but
real
yeah,
freak, wasn't he?
That was neat.
but I can't say that I don't like him as a character because I feel like, you know, he needs to get his act together. Let's hope that he gets his act together and then I would like him as a person. But
I
Yeah.
yeah.
think the painting on the airplane
Oh gosh.
really put it over the
Oh,
edge, though. Because, I mean, you can kind of go, oh, okay, people make mistakes, but that, like, okay, then you're just like, no, I don't like you anymore at all.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I don't want to be his friend for sure.
Yeah. But I
He
thought it was
needs,
brilliant how you had Howie and I can't remember the other guy's name. Gabriel?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was brilliant. And then
I like
all
them.
the details that you have in there, like he's wearing the hat, when they're traveling and
Mhm.
or the helmet or whatever, and it was to cover that up. I was like, yeah, it was really cool.
Thanks. I liked writing that a little bit. They're just stand-up people. I talk about them like they're real. They're not real. But, you know.
They are to you. You brought them
Right.
to
And
life.
there were people doing that sort of thing.
Yeah.
They're real in my heart.
Yeah. Another question we have is where do you go for most of your research? In person, two places, nonfiction books, real people, online?
Mhm. I mean, I didn't go to North Africa for this one because
Darn
that'd be a
it.
pretty hefty plane. I mean, it would be cool, but that's not the kind of budget I have for travel right now. Um, but a lot of times I start with a general overview resource. So I read several books on Casablanca and then the war in North Africa, some kind of more dense military history stuff that we didn't even really get into.
Mhm.
Um, and that I don't personally find interesting all the details of every battle and
Right.
which destroyer was sunk when and that's not my thing, but it's kind of important to kind of get the lay of the land and figure out what happened before and what happens after the story. And then I usually dig into whatever specific thing I'm talking about. So I read a bunch of books and online resources on the USO tours, especially the ones that went through North Africa. And then I like to do primary source research of just people's letters. And thankfully, it's really easily available, whether online or there are collections of them. There are newspaper articles you can find talking about these different tours and things like that. Um, and anytime there's like a photo essay or a collection of images, that really helps too. If I'm writing about a location I've never been to, Google Earth is really helpful. So are a lot of postcards of the time that soldiers sent back, so you can get a sense of what some of the landmarks are that they were looking at. Um, yeah, the Again, once you get into the nitty-gritty of research details, it gets a little harder. Like if you're looking at the naval ship registries, they have documented like when every ship came into port, but it's sometimes hard to parse and it gets kind of boring, but every job has its boring parts.
There you go.
Um, so when I can, for both the Blackout Book Club, which is set in Maine, I did some on-site research for that. Um, and obviously there's one set in Minnesota, so that was nice and easy for me. But yeah, if I could travel for all of them, I would. But when you can't, sometimes I would find somebody who lived in that area for the one. Like I wrote my second one set in the Pacific Northwest during 2020, and we were not traveling at that point. So had a friend. I asked a few questions of friends who lived in that area.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was thinking we had Angela Bell on here, Ladies Guide to Marvels and Misadventures
Yeah, she's
last
a
fall,
delight.
and she has some really intricate details about landmark places from
Mhm.
Victorian England. And I was like, how do you get this? And she was like, Google, like you can just find so much of this online that it's such a blessing that you can really get those details without having to travel all the way across the world. So
That is true.
super fun. Um, does anybody else have any other questions or comments for Amy?
I have one question. Have you ever wanted to write like a series, or because there's so much research involved, are you like, no, I just want to wrap it up, tie it up with a bow, and it's done? Because you mentioned the one, you could have done book one and book two for World War
Hmm.
One and World War Two, and you're like, no, 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 I decided to just put it into
Yeah.
one.
Hmm.
Have you ever wanted to, or is it because it's just it's so hard because of all the research? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a
Because this story, I just love this book. I'm
uh,
like, I would love to see like a sequel or whatever. And I was just curious if you've ever thought of that or if it's just too hard.
yeah, I some writers really like doing series and that's their thing and it's, even if like short series, long series, the following one character through a lot of events. And I think the reason I don't is A, laziness, because like you said of all the research that would go into and also keeping track of things. Organization is not my strong suit, as you might have guessed from the fact that I write books out of order. So it would be people who write series have to do a very good job of keeping track of how old their characters are and what the town looks like and all of these other details. It's not to say I would never do it. In this stage of my life, organization is just not a thing that's going to happen to that level of detail. But I have considered writing like a little novella, like set at Christmas or something for one of my books that I've already written, maybe. But and none of the books I've written will be a series, as far as I know. Haven't written enough in the future because again, writing styles change when you have more time and things like that. Oh, I said there were other reasons. So one, I'm lazy. Two is I'm often writing about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and you don't often have that happen twice. So, it could be different with things like the USO tour because they might go to other places, but the war is about to end by the time the book is over. And so they wouldn't do a whole lot more after this. And they would probably just go back to their ordinary lives as opposed to like a detective who gets lots of cases and they're constantly involved in extraordinary circumstances. Or people who write romance, like they follow the romances of three sisters in the family and all of them find their happily ever after. But since I specifically kind of follow ordinary people during a specific time um, of the war or of history, that they're a part of an important moment, when that moment's gone, don't know that there would be that much interesting to write about after that. But who knows? Who can say?
Who can say?
So I never say no. Never. I never say never.
Well, here's another question. We'll see if you'll say never to. Ms. Grove is
Mhm.
wondering, do you ever think you'll write a modern book, contemporary, versus the
Mhm.
historical ones?
Yeah. I I don't know because I find the aspect of history the most fun part of writing.
Mm-hmm.
If I ever wrote something like if my girls got older and I was like, ooh, let's write stories for your age group or something like that, that was something totally different, maybe I would.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I would write modern contemporary set fiction for adults. Um, but again, who
Who
knows?
knows? Wherever the muse takes you.
Yep, we're not going to rule it out for sure.
Well, you seem to be doing so well and have found a good niche and something you love, so I say stick with it.
I'm having fun, that's for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, that's great. All right. Well, we would love to know where can people connect with you further?
Mhm. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. Those are the two social media places where I regularly post things. I also send out a quarterly newsletter, which you can sign up for on my website, which is amygreenbooks.com. And that's also where I have the history behind the scenes thing. And the newsletter is usually just some writing news, maybe book recommendations, what I've been reading lately, and then just a set of 4 fun things that I found, like, oh, here are 4 fun recipes I found, or 4 fun literary themed clothing, and things like that, which are a lot of fun to put together. So those are the main ways that I keep in touch with readers. And I always love if you read another one of my books and you just want to send me a note on my website, there's a place to do that too. And I love hearing from readers.
Awesome. And I do want to remind everyone to please leave a review for her on Amazon is especially helpful because those reviews help authors so much. And there's also Goodreads and like a million other places. But yeah, that's really helpful if you've read it and you can give her a review. That's super helpful to her.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we appreciate you so much, Amy, for being here and sharing the background of your writing and this wonderful book. It's been super fun to hear your stories and get to know you better.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I always enjoy talking books with my fellow bookish friends. So this was a delight.
Awesome.